In this discussion, we'll be exploring body awareness. We're all embodied beings at all times. It's not possible to not be embodied. All of our experience is embodied experience. We're not mental beings who have a body, so our practice of body awareness is not to increase our awareness of the body as if it were somehow separate from ourself, but rather to relax into awareness as experienced through the body, to allow our conscious minds to surrender into embodied experiencing. This approach is especially useful and relevant for the fruitional view. I've been in many therapies over a lot of years, and while there are some ways of working in therapy that focus on body experience, which I think are very valuable, the traditional Western approach is to talk about emotions and thoughts. I can't remember any sort of mainstream therapist that I ever worked with ever asking me or being curious about what sensations I might be experiencing as we explored important issues. I've also been fortunate to have experienced a lot of body work, Rolfing, massage, core energetics, a lot of things that have been very valuable. And for me, most of those experiences were somehow separate from awareness practices or from working with therapeutic issues. So a lot of my interest has been to hold both the developmental view, working with our story, working with our history, working with conditioned patterns of behavior, and also with immediacy. And today we'll be focusing especially on what it means to practice embodied immediacy. What I've found over some time is that encouraging people I work with, for my own experience, that focusing on sensations especially often is very helpful. A view that's supported by cross-cultural research is that for all people in all cultures, it seems that there are probably 6 or 7 fundamental states of affective arousal, basic biological responses to life: anger, happiness, sadness, disgust, fear and anxiety, and surprise. However, when researchers attempt to determine distinct emotions, they come up with lists of 256 or 312 emotions. The implication, I think, is that emotions are strongly interpretive. For every basic state of affective arousal, there may be many different interpretations, resulting in many different emotions. Even more fundamental than these basic states of affective arousal are just raw sensations. All humans have sensations, and my guess is that they're pretty much the same for all of us. Example, if we feel a tight stomach, if our heart is beating fast, shallow breathing, it's really going to depend on whether we're meeting a lover or going to the doctor about our emotion, how we interpret that experience. But if we were to stay embodied just at the sensation level, we may find that it actually is pretty much the same experience. So we start to realize that it's not only thoughts that carry our interpretive history, but emotions do as well, often in even more powerful and less obvious ways. I think that focusing on sensations reflects an idea that sensations somehow are more basic, more fundamental to our experiencing than emotions and thoughts. This seems accurate to me if I look at evolution, if I look at my own personal development or my children's development. It seems pretty clear to me that physicality comes first, both in life and individually. Then emotional experience seems to develop, and then intellectual experience, conceptual experience develops. So from that point of view, sensations are very reliable, very human, and actually not very shaped by personal history. It seems to be mostly our interpretations that give shape to immediate experience in a way that fits with our patterned, conditioned history. Of course, thoughts trigger feelings and sensations, which then can trigger more thoughts. Obviously, there's a circular process, and some therapies, perhaps something like cognitive behavioral work, tend to focus on thoughts as a point of intervention. But a lot of my interest, especially from a fruitional point of view, is to find a variety of ways in which we can find out what is most accurate at any given moment, what is most reliable, what can we count on, what can we find support from. And my experience is that the only thing we can really count on for support in our lives is the truth of our immediate experience. But especially in our culture, support often, in an unexamined way, is thought to be synonymous with positive feelings. If I want support from a friend, I usually want positive feelings to come from that. But of course, we don't always feel positive. Life isn't just positive. And so anytime we have to deal with negativity, we don't feel supported. We're not committed to that experience of negativity. But if we continue to go beneath what we call negative, we may find that the large amount of what we call negative is interpretive. That if we stay at the sensation level, it's possible we will not find the problem that we were trying to avoid. As we're able to commit equally to experiencing positive feelings and to experience negative feelings, we find that life actually supports us because we're ready to commit to the truth of our experience. And that's what's going to support us, not our fantasies or preferences. They're fine as long as we know that's what they are. So in this discussion, it's important to make clear that we're not talking about taking sides between sensations and interpretations. They're both very valid. Our lives would not work very well without interpretations. But in this particular type of work where we're interested in the experience of freedom, of feeling at peace with life, supported by life, learning to keep our heart open to others, it seems to me that it's very useful to have a sort of experiential dialogue available at all times between our immediate, embodied, sensation level experience and our interpretations of that experience, and find out for ourselves at any moment, well, what actually is most true right now. Personally, I've never found a sensation of abandonment or shame or guilt or any of the many sort of emotions that are so difficult for us to work with. So if I were working with a client who had a low self-esteem issue or a shame issue, I would probably somewhat frequently invite them to consider letting themselves feel that shame, and then, well, what are the sensations right now that you're aware of? What is it like to feel shame? Where's the intensity in your body? Some people have access to that, some don't. But if somebody does, they often will say something like, well, my stomach's very tight, or I have this heaviness in my heart, or I feel this sort of flush in my face, or my body wants to sort of curl up, which I think is great, that they can be aware of that, and then they can investigate, if they choose, well, where's the problem in that? Where's even the shame in those sensations? If you stay at the sensation level, no interpretation, where's the shame? Is it killing you to feel a tight stomach, a heavy heart? Do you think it's giving you cancer? Do you think you're becoming dysfunctional, that the world's going to come and attack you? Where's the evidence that there's any problem whatsoever in feeling this intensity in your body? This doesn't make somebody's issue of shame go away, but again, it begins an experiential dialogue where perhaps when somebody has to deal with their experience of shame, they may have a recollection, either as a practice or spontaneously, to ask, well, what's beneath that? What is even more true than this feeling? Do I have to take this experience of shame as if it's the whole story, as if it's a description of reality? Because if it's the whole story, of course, I have to do something with it. I have to get rid of it, or improve it, or work it through, or something. But if it's not really what's most true, then I have to experience it, but maybe I don't have to actually make it go away. or heal it. So, in the developmental approach, we're usually placing our experience in the context of past, present, and future, and we don't really need to be aware of what our tight stomach feels like if we're trying to understand, let's say, how our parents' divorce left us with a vulnerability of always feeling abandoned. But if we're approaching our experience from a fruitional point of view, our practice is to return over and over and over again to embodied immediacy, to cut interpretations, to see what's most true in the moment. If we're not even paying attention to our sensations, then we will be captured by this historic display. It's very fascinating. It's very sort of convincing in its appearance. So for that person who's dealing with abandonment issues, a fruitional approach at that moment, not instead of the developmental approach, but in addition, at another moment, what does it feel like right now to feel abandoned? And I often go through those same sort of questions with people. Is it killing me? Is it harming me? Where's the evidence in my sensations of abandonment, let's say? I have this heavy heart. I have this feeling of yearning. My throat is tight. Where in any of those sensations is evidence about my worth as a person? If somebody is able and willing to investigate in that way, they may find that once again, I don't like those feelings. I wish I didn't have those sensations, but I actually can't find any evidence of harm. So at that point, I often encourage people to perhaps say out loud, just to see what it feels like, well, I give myself permission to feel like an abandoned person off and on for the rest of my life. So what? It sucks. We don't like it. But so what? Can I actually commit to having this experience because it's not harmful and because perhaps I'm stuck with it? These core vulnerabilities are embedded at very, very deep levels. But if I'm willing to commit to this experience because I have investigated, it's not my therapist's belief system, but I have investigated and I don't see any evidence of harm, then maybe I could get on with my life instead of putting it on hold until I no longer feel abandoned, or looking for a partner who will never abandon me, which is, of course, not how it works usually. So a theme that we have been exploring in these discussions is that both the experience of neurosis and, in a fruitional understanding, the experience of being an alienated, significant self, both seem to depend on, to arise from, a sense of a basic split, a disconnection from deeper vulnerabilities from a Western point of view, from our always present awareness from a more Buddhist point of view. So if we return to the idea that neurosis is always a substitute or an avoidance of experiential intensity, and we understand that intensity is always experienced in the body, therefore to avoid experiential intensity, we have to leave our bodies. We have to dissociate. We have to bring our attention out of our immediate embodied experience because that's where the intensity is found. It's true, of course, that we'll go into interpretive states, stories and dramas that have their own type of intensity, but once we become familiar with these dramas, we'll find out basically it's the same drama over and over again. If we were to watch a scary movie over and over again, it still might be scary on some level, but we sort of know down deep we can handle it. We know the beginning, the middle, the end. It's not a new threat, even though it feels scary. So most of us recycle our basic dramas just continually as a way to distract our attention from our immediate embodied experiencing. So we can understand then that disembodiment is a requirement of neurosis. It's very, very difficult, I believe, to sustain any avoidance strategy if we're aware of what we're avoiding. It doesn't serve its function. So in a developmental approach, we tend to deal with symptom-specific issues, specific work, where we're dealing with guilt, or we're dealing with sexual inhibitions, or we're dealing with a fear of failure at work, or something like that, as if these specific issues have an historic origin and can be worked through. And often that's very accurate. A fruitional approach is that we are working with getting to the heart of all neurosis. It doesn't matter what the specific issue is. It's a generic approach. It's not symptom-specific. So from this point of view, the approach of dissolving neurotic organization basically is to re-embody. And it doesn't matter what we are re-embodying to. It doesn't matter what the history was. We're just returning to immediate sensation-level experience over and over and over again. Of course, avoiding disturbance, avoiding experiential intensity, which is the function of neurosis, is always easier in the moment than to go into our disturbance. So it's very helpful in my work to understand that neurosis is always easier in the moment. Sanity is always more difficult in the moment. In the long run, of course, neurosis actually leads to a deterioration in the quality of one's life, because we're not dealing with the truth of things. We're trying to not deal with the truth, and of course we then don't handle our life very skillfully. In the long run, sanity actually leads to an improvement in the quality of our life, because we're dealing with what's true, and we're gradually learning how to deal with very deep, difficult issues, even if they don't go away. So I think it's helpful to understand that sanity is a counter-instinctual practice. We're never going to want to practice sanity. It's difficult. We have to have the discipline of re-embodying, and it's usually into sensations that historically have been associated with actual emotional survival level issues as children. So a lot of people, of course, are a little puzzled about why they're so invested in neurosis. We've talked about it from a couple of different angles. This is another one. Just to understand, it's always easier. It's easier if you're hiking to step down rather than to step up. But of course, if you continually step down because it's easier, at the end, you're down. There's not much potential. If it were a physical system, there's not much kinetic energy in the system there, not much potential to work with, to play with. We've sort of exhausted our potential by always taking the immediately easy step. So the work of embodiment often has to be a discipline. It's not just an easy thing to do. So that's why we have to understand the view, why it might be to our benefit to do this work, to go into our anxiety, into our tight stomach, our sort of panicky feelings in our torso, into this tight throat that I hate to feel. So I talk with people, as I've said earlier, a fair amount about the view, about why it might make sense to do something that is so counter-instinctual on just a very basic biological level. So perhaps it would be helpful to use a little exercise to explore this idea that the practice of embodiment often has to be a discipline. There has to be an intention there. It's not something that's just going to spontaneously occur to us often. So if you would like, as you're listening, you could ask yourself, what is one issue in my life that I really, really have a hard time dealing with? Perhaps I feel lonely, perhaps I feel claustrophobic, perhaps I feel uncared for, perhaps I feel smothered, maybe I feel guilt, maybe I feel overwhelmed and exhausted. Whatever we may find as a repetitive issue, you could just take a moment and say to yourself, well, perhaps I'm going to feel this way off and on for the rest of my life. I certainly have felt it for a long time, maybe all of my life up to this point. Maybe there's no evidence that it's just going to go away. I've been to therapy, I've done spiritual practice, so maybe it's time to actually explore the possibility of having a relationship to this experience that I don't like, rather than all of my increasingly sophisticated ways of trying to make it go away. So if you'd like, you could just settle in a little bit. If you're sitting, feel the weight of your body in the chair. Be present, maybe be aware of your breath. And then give yourself permission to feel this exact feeling that you really don't like to feel, as if it is a legitimate part of your life, as if you may have to feel it off and on for the rest of your life. But as you invite this feeling, try to bring your attention out of any interpretation at all into whatever raw sensation is happening. Not everybody has this experience, but most people find that the torso is sort of the resonating field of emotional experiential intensity. So you could just check it out and see, perhaps there's a lot of agitation, maybe I feel numb from the neck down, maybe it's in my hands, maybe it's very pervasive through my whole body, maybe I don't have any awareness of sensation except behind my eyes. It doesn't really matter. It's more to just direct our attention to the sensation level of that experience. So, as I've mentioned, one of my historically dissociated experiences was that of dependency. So I'm just letting myself at the moment experience dependency, being a dependent person, as sensation. What I'm immediately aware of is some sense of grief, sadness that seems to be in my chest. There's also a little sense of collapse. Part of my body wants to just collapse. A little tightness in my stomach. But then my next question is, well, so what? Do any of these sensations harm me? If I stay just at the sensation level, no interpretation at all, is there any evidence about my worth as a person? About my being worthy of love or not? I don't find that. So that gives me, at that moment, an immediate confidence, which might just be developed incrementally, of course, but an immediate confidence that it's okay to feel dependent. I don't like it. I probably won't change my style of self-sufficiency, but it doesn't really matter if I feel dependent. I can find that out for myself right now. For me, anyway, there's a certain type of, a little bit of relief or confidence that seems associated with that clarity. But just check that out for yourself, see what's true for you. If you find that practice of interest, then you might consider building it into your daily life in some way. It might just be for 30 seconds in the morning or something. It's not a big time commitment. But in my experience, this type of work where we gradually bring into dialogue our historic claim that it's really, really dangerous and bad to feel a certain way, with our immediate experience that there's no evidence of threat, actually, of harm. That experiential investigation actually has to be done thousands of times. We have to do it over and over and over, thousands of times, I think, until most of us gradually start to dissolve our tendency to just accept the idea that this is a threat to feel this way, to gradually develop an embodied confidence that says, well, so what? I'm ready to feel this any second. I've done this thousands of times now. It's never harmed me yet. So often when I work with people, I suggest a sort of homework or things they can do in their daily life. I have an opinion that practicing in daily life is probably more powerful than an hour of therapy, but both are perhaps helpful. But I suggest that people find some way to remind themselves or structure in that type of practice of immediacy. If they can do it once a day, great, once a week, whatever. But like most things, the more we practice something, probably the better we'll get. Seems to be pretty likely. So if somebody can start to recall that question spontaneously or through structure 20 times a day, things will probably move along a little faster than if it's once a week. So that could become just a question, and a very practical version of that I often suggest people consider is that any time they're aware of any avoidant behavior, if they're going into obsessional thinking, if they feel too busy, if they're going into a drama about how somebody's not treating them well, if they're feeling complaint or resentment, any of those things, anytime we're disturbed, we could ask ourselves, I wonder what I'm experiencing in my body at the sensation level right this second. Because almost always, when we are in a familiar, avoidant energy, there will be right at that moment a more vulnerable, sensation-based experience that we're trying not to feel. So why not just train ourselves to use our disturbance not as a problem, but as a signal to wake up, to pay attention, to just be curious. Well, what am I feeling right now? And is it a problem? And again, just to stay at the sensation level. No interpretation. We're not trying to heal it or understand it or anything. If we'd like to take it into an even more intense experience, we could recall our discussion in the last session about anxiety. Anxiety is so difficult, so pervasive, so connected with survival level responses. How are we going to actually learn to work with anxiety without the capacity, the training, to stay embodied at all times? So even though it is very valuable to practice re-embodiment with our historically conditioned issues, it may be even more valuable to do this very difficult practice of re-embodiment, staying embodied with anxiety. So if you'd like, you could experiment with that practice, and I hope it will be helpful. One specific version of this work, which is sort of tricky to work with, but I thought it would be good to mention, is the work with traumatic organization. I try my best to be aware of the potential for traumatic organization in people I work with, but the very nature of trauma as opposed to neurotic organization is that trauma seems to be very encapsulated. It's almost like this little energetic cyst in the emotional system, and there's not a lot of warning sometimes when you're going to touch it. Whereas neurotic organization is very integrated and pervasive, and you can always find the display of neurosis in my experience, even within a couple of minutes of working with somebody, I usually have a pretty intuitive sense of what their avoidant style is. But often I don't see the traumatic organization until it might get triggered. So every once in a while I get surprised by this, and it's a difficult energy to work with. I usually actually refer people to therapists who specialize in trauma work if it becomes clear that there's a significant degree of traumatic organization. Because I've found that this work, the fruitional work, is very intense. It invites people to go immediately into their disturbance. And if somebody has enough resilience, that's fine, but sometimes this work can actually trigger very intense reactivity. So that's maybe a little caution or just an acknowledgement that no style of work is a good fit for everybody, and the work that I'm discussing really is best suited for people with basically neurotic levels of organization, not pre-neurotic, not people who would be called borderline or psychotic, not people with really pretty pervasive traumatic organization. But what happens usually for all of us to some extent or another is that when we feel injured, when we feel traumatized, when we feel overwhelmed, metaphorically it's like an injury. It's like a degree of intensity that our young systems cannot process or metabolize, as we've talked about. So often the body will respond by contracting around what we can't digest, what feels like a threat or overwhelming. For example, if I hurt my knee, my body would tend to freeze and around that, and it would get a little stiff as a form of protection. But even when the injury has healed, the traumatic organization will tend to persist. And that's one understanding of traumatic organization that has changed in the last probably 30 years, that when I first started therapy, most people talked about trauma as if it were still present in somebody's system. But I think a more accurate understanding has been growing that actually it's the traumatic organization, our protective strategies, that persist over time, even when, of course, that event or that disturbance has passed. But just like an injured knee, if it's been stiff for quite a while, and then I start to recover use of that part of myself, my body, then as I start moving my knee again, it's going to hurt because it's been immobilized for so long. It's tight. There's not a lot of circulation in it. And that pain and the associated panic then can be taken as evidence that the trauma is still there. The injury is still there. If I were to be watching a movie with my legs crossed and one of my legs went to sleep, it's going to be numb and it's not going to hurt while it's numb. But if I want to recover use of that part of myself, I have to allow circulation to come back. And often there's this sort of pins and needles experience, which is not pleasant. So re-embodying, especially around traumatic organization, but even in just more manageable levels of overwhelm, is often a very disturbing experience. The trauma work that I think is most congruent with this sort of approach is where the therapist helps the person very, very slowly re-enter their body without going into a re-traumatizing experience. So the same principles, I think, apply, but I think it's very helpful when there are intense issues to make sure that we're working with somebody whose specialty that is. Another metaphor for this sort of issue is to imagine that as children, we actually learn to anesthetize ourselves. If I had my hand over a fire, let's say I'm in a tough situation as a kid that I can't get out of, I can't go find new parents, then the best thing I can do is to numb up my hand. It's still going to be hurt, but at least I won't feel so much pain all the time. But once I'm an adult, if my hand remains numb, I might leave it over the fire because I'm not even aware of the hurt, the pain, the damage. So it's very important as adults to dissolve the anesthesia that almost all of us had to learn to apply to our experiencing as children. If I were going into a surgery, I would want anesthesia. I don't want to stay embodied and present while somebody cuts open my stomach. I would rather be numb. But when the surgery is over, it's very important to come out of the anesthesia. And often, if you've been through operations, you know that's not exactly pleasant to go through that. So these are all a variety of ways of talking about the difficulty of doing the very, very important work of re-embodying. coming out of our historic anesthesia, split, dissociation, repression. There's a lot of language for it, but it's all pretty much the same idea. And a fruitional point of view just goes right to the mechanism of neurosis rather than the content of the neurosis. This work of focusing on sensations is something like that of meditation, actually. And in fact, in Buddhist meditation, the mindfulness of the body is the first of the four mindfulness practices, probably the practice that's common to almost every form of Buddhism, although there's a lot of other variations. And what we're doing really is, when we attend to sensations, is we're taking our attention away from our drama, our story. Just like when we return to the breath in meditation, we're taking our attention away from all of our discursive thinking. We're not saying that thinking is wrong, hopefully. We're just interrupting that activity by attending to something that it's very difficult to make a story out of. So in my work, I invite people to just attend to sensations with absolutely no interpretation. And unlike some types of body-centered therapy where the invitation is to stay embodied and then listen to the message that our body is trying to give us, which of course is valuable work, this is different. I'm not encouraging anybody to listen to any message and to consider maybe there is no message. Maybe it's just immediate experience. Why do we have to have a meaning about it? Is there a problem in just staying embodied at that moment? As we do this work, staying embodied, no interpretations, attending to sensations, my experience is that energy that has been suppressed and constricted begins to be released. It's almost as if our attention, our kindness, experientially validates that energy's right to manifest, to arise into consciousness. So when stored energy is released, it's often disturbing. Sometimes it might even be expressed somatically through physical symptoms. But usually, once this energy begins to be validated through our attention, through our willingness to not have to make it into some meaningful experience, it seems to have a life of its own. We seem to experience more movement. As a therapist, I never know where that movement's going to go. If I'm working with an individual and they start loosening up their experience of immediate aliveness, I don't know if it's going to have a happy outcome or not. If it's a couple, I don't know if they start to loosen the ritualized dynamics that have kept them in a type of pseudo-security. I don't know if they loosen that up, if they'll stay together. So this work isn't about knowing what the outcome will be. This is about a commitment to our aliveness, our immediacy, and then a confidence that we will work with whatever arises. But paradoxically, the more that we have dissociated as a way of gaining a type of security or stability, actually the less confidence we have, because we're not in touch with what's actually true at the moment, what's most fundamentally our experience. So the more we avoid immediacy, intensity, the less confidence we have in our ability to work with ourselves and our life. Also, there's less continuity of awareness, and there's less direct experience of our already existing wholeness. But when we stay embodied, however disturbing, with no interpretation, we start to actually develop a type of unconditional confidence that whatever happens, we're ready to work with it. Not as a theory, but because we're actually there, we're present, we're working with it. We also start to develop a sense of continuity of awareness. We can see, we can feel that we're still present through all of these experiences, and we find out that there is no such thing as a static, permanent experience. Our sensations are always in motion. There's nothing really to hang on to there. There's no interpretation that's going to fit even in the next moment. that continuity of awareness also starts to give rise to a certain type of confidence that we can be present, we can work with our experience. So it's a little strange, but the more we go for security and avoiding disturbance, the less confident we are to work with it. The more we go into experiential intensity, into immediate embodiment, are willing at any second to feel any degree of horrible feelings, the more confident we become in working with it. My experience is that as we remain embodied, what we find out is that all intense experience seems to have a wave-like life of its own. It's not a fixed state. And our job then becomes to ride this wave of intensity while remaining embodied all the way through. Not to manage it, not to heal it, not to understand it, but just to consciously participate in the experience. When we do not do that, of course, we tend to be aggressive to our experience, and especially to intense experience, because that's what feels most threatening. But when we can train ourselves to let our intense experience have a life of its own, and staying at the sensation level really supports that, because we find there's no problem. It's scary or whatever, but there's no problem actually. We begin to have an approximation, what in Buddhist jargon is called the experience of self-liberation, that our experience is self-liberating. It takes care of itself. We don't actually have to do anything with our experience. The very best way to explore that possibility is to remain embodied and see if it's accurate that our experience will take care of itself. If we ride this sort of wave of intensity through, then one of the benefits is that we now have the possibility of having some choice about skillful means, about how to engage with this situation that was disturbing. Whereas if we dissociate out of some panic while this intense wave is happening, then we usually go into a very primitive fight or flight conditioned response. Our choice of skillful means is very limited. We'll sort of always do the same thing. When we can allow intensity to have its own life, we find, oh, I can try all sorts of things now. My kids just disturbed me. Well, instead of yelling at them, which might be my response, if I can just stay embodied and let it come and go, now I could do all sorts of things. I could talk, I could joke with them, I could have a conflict, I could be logical, I could just let it drop, I could have behavioral consequences. But at that point, my engagement with my life can actually be about the situation. If I'm acting from a panicky response of getting out of my immediate embodied intensity, I've got to dissociate, I've got to get out of there, then my response to my children, let's say, is basically going to be an attempt to get out of my feelings. And so, of course, it's not going to be so skillful. But most people, in my experience, most of the time, when they feel intense experience, engage with their life to get out of their feeling of intensity. And of course, that's not usually very successful. In the realm of relationship, one of the experiences that I have had, that many people seem to have, is that the more we can stay embodied, no interpretation, the more grounded we feel, the more confident we feel in our experience, which allows us then to engage more intimately with another person's experience because we don't feel so threatened by it. We're embodied with our experience. Whereas if we approach somebody in a more dissociative state from our neurotic organization, then that other person's version of reality can feel very threatening because we're not in touch with our own. And often then we go into this black and white response where, well, I guess I have to cue off of their reality. And the two basic ways that people do that are to go into a state of fusion where I just become an extension of their reality, or I have to make sure there's a lot of distance to protect myself from their reality. We'll talk about this more in the relationship discussion, but it's a very pervasive issue, actually, that to the extent that somebody is not grounded in, embodied with the truth of their experience, they tend to always cue off of other people's experience, usually with not such great consequences. So as we stay embodied, as we gain more confidence, more clarity, are willing to experience very intense states, we may find that this work actually supports transformative change. Not only is it helpful in the moment, but it also might be part of our wish to gain more access to awareness, to clarity. One metaphor that I sometimes discuss with people is that of the crucible. In the alchemical tradition in the Middle Ages, the sort of surface version was to change lead into gold, let's say. The spiritual path work was to find ways to transmute confusion into wisdom or neurosis into sanity. And one of the main metaphors of that work was the crucible. You would put the lead, the ore, into a crucible, a container, and really crank up the heat. And as that material became so hot, the impurities would begin to settle apart from the pure essence, the gold. So as a metaphor, we could consider that if we want to invite transformative change in our life, perhaps we have to learn to use our own body as a crucible. The qualities of a crucible would be that it has to not break, it has to withstand a lot of heat, not chemically interact with what's in it. And in a similar way, the more that we can learn to hold and experience intense energy, experiential energy in our bodies, the more likely it is that we invite transformative change. But most people, of course, for obvious reasons, take intensity as a threat, and in our culture the two basic choices are repression or discharge. So most people have a tendency and a style of responding with a repressive reaction when they feel disturbed, or they tend to want to discharge it, either yell or scream or just talk about it, process it with their therapist or something, but basically to get the disturbance out of their body. But something in the middle might be the possibility of feeling flooded with intensity and doing absolutely nothing about it. We don't have to push it away, we don't have to discharge it. We can just train ourselves to tolerate very, very intense sensation. I remember at one point a while ago when I was waking up in the middle of the night with intense panic, and I tried different things to get rid of it or to go back to sleep, and then it occurred to me, well, maybe I just need to lay here and feel this really, really disturbing experience. And it was like molten iron or something just flowing through my body. It was really disturbing. And I found out that it didn't harm me. And it seemed to have its own life. I never understood it. I didn't even try to understand it, but it had its own life, and after a while it just didn't happen anymore. But the whole attitude of being willing to feel flooded with intensity at any moment actually gives rise to a very strong confidence in our capacity to be present, engaged, keep our heart open. I've found it very, very valuable. Alan Watts has a very interesting way of talking about this whole question of embodied experiencing, when he's talking about this same sort of view that our experiencing actually is ourself. It's not that there's a self that's experiencing. So he uses some fun examples, like we can say it's hot today, the sun is shining, it's nighttime, it's snowing, as if there is an it that's hot or an it that's snowing. But obviously there's no it that's snowing, there just happens to be snow coming down. In a similar way, we say, I'm happy or I'm sad, but perhaps there's no I that is happy or sad. Perhaps there's just the experience of happiness and sadness happening. Dogen, a Zen master, said, mindfulness of the body is the body's mindfulness. I think pointing to the same understanding that there's no I being mindful. There's only our embodied experiencing happening. And the whole drama of myself relating to my experience is a drama. There is awareness of experience, of course, but that awareness turns out not to be personal. And the more we can stay embodied at the sensation level, the more we dissolve our fascination with this drama of personal intensity. So this fruitional view is that, once again, that awakened mind, open awareness, is already and always the ground of our experience. It doesn't really matter if our experience is clear or confused, our awareness is always there. But we tend to have greater access to this experience of openness when we attend to raw body experience rather than mental experience. It's less distractive, less personal, less fascinating, more straightforward, and sort of cleaner in a certain way. So a lot of my work involves a constant invitation to those that I work with, and this is something I do for myself, of course, that there's some alternation back and forth between exploring our conditioned interpretive experience, because that's the vivid experience we have to work with, but over and over again to return to sensation, where there's no interpretation, and there's an immediate aliveness, immediate reality that we find actually is more trustworthy than any interpretation of that experience. And this dialogue back and forth I find to be very helpful. So if there were something to perhaps take from this discussion, my hope would be a curiosity, a willingness to experiment with the view that to dissolve what we call neurotic organization, avoidant experience, the basic split, perhaps we do not actually have to go through all of our history, all of our story, but instead, perhaps we can just get right to the root of what gives rise and sustains neurotic organization by re-embodying, understanding that dissociation is a requirement for neurosis, and so re-embodiment is the antidote. So our next discussion will be about intimacy and relationships. This is something that I have been extremely interested in for a long time. I work with couples a lot. And as difficult as the work we've been talking about up to this point is, it gets extremely difficult when we start to relate to an intimate partner. So we'll be talking about how to bring all of these practices and views that we've talked about pretty much as individual practices now to the very provocative, unresolvable arena of relationship.